So many critics argue that proposals to close all prisons and legalize drugs overlook the need for justice, especially for victims of violent crimes. How do you respond to those who believe that justice and punishment are necessary, particularly in cases like rape or robbery?
Well, I think it rather depends on what you mean by justice. I mean, and everyone uses that word as if somehow we all have an identical sort of belief in what that looks like. For me, justice is something which must you have to look at the whole system. You have to look at the whole of our society and look at the way that we use criminal justice, and in particular the way that we use imprisonment and very long sentences of imprisonment, including in cases connected to drugs. And we have to look at all of that and ask ourselves, what's the consequence of it? And so when I came to look at this, and I wrote my book Justice on Trial a few years back, I actually traveled around the world and I looked at exactly that issue. So those countries which have the attitude that punishment basically that justice is about punishment, those societies, and the United States is the most obvious example, have very, very large prison populations. And in the US, it's 2.5 million or thereabouts. They have a huge percentage of certain communities who are in prison at any given time. And in the long run, I don't think many people would say that as a result of that, life is safer on the streets of Chicago or Oakland or any other sort of major metropolitan area in the US. And that's my problem with the idea of justice in the form of punishment, is that punishment almost always, if that's your driving motivation, almost always results in two things, which is firstly, the vast expense of a criminal justice system, which is designed to process people into and out of prison indefinitely. So this huge $1 trillion industry in the United States of the system of mass incarceration. And that of itself is plainly deeply draining on society. Those billions and billions of dollars going into basically just warehousing people, often for decades or even for lifetimes, in the case of many in the United States. All of that money could be put to better use to achieve what I think the system should really be about and what justice really looks like, which is finding a way that when people transgress the criminal law, when they break the criminal law, find a way to focus on the only thing that I think that matters, which is that they don't do it again. And that means that there's not going to be another victim of the same person. And for me, the one thing that is absolutely critical to any analysis is that you cannot bring back, as it were, the dead who have been murdered. You can't stop the crimes that have already been committed. What you need to do is focus on how you're going to stop the same sorts of crimes happening again and again. And that's where mass incarceration has failed abysmally over the last 50 or 60 years.
Where do you think the underlying philosophies, motivations, incentives sprouted from to trace justice to punishment? Like, was
Well,
there a nice... Go ahead.
yeah, it's a very good question, and I did write about this extensively in my book. I went back to the beginning of time, the beginning of recorded history and even some prehistory, and looked at the societies which first formed criminal justice systems of one kind or another. And the ones that most people will be familiar will be the Romans and the ancient Greeks, so going back thousands of years ago. But the same applies to ancient Egypt and other ancient cultures. And going back to those days, the idea of vengeance, of a blood price being paid for a crime, was absolutely part of the culture and part of the thinking around criminal justice, albeit mostly for the poor, because the rich often had options to buy their way out of trouble, as you could argue is the same in our day and age. But that's where it all comes from. It was often allied to religious beliefs. So Christianity over the years, particularly if you think about the Old Testament, that famous the adage about an eye for an eye, that is very deeply ingrained in our psychology, particularly in Christian countries and Christian societies. And the irony, of course, is that those same religions are the very religions that also argue for mercy and kindness and compassion. But somehow or other, when it comes to criminal justice, we've drawn upon is the sort of the more vengeful elements of those religious sentiments. As I say, going back different religions over many generations. We've drawn the vengeance lesson, but what we haven't done is incorporate within it the kind of attitudes to mercy and also to redemption, which many religions have at their core, but they tend not to find their way into our criminal justice policies in our modern societies.
So then how do we update justice to not be punishment, but to be something else? Well, what is that something else, first of all? Are there any tried and true examples?
Yes, I mean, there's something else, in my view, is very straightforward. It's harm reduction. How do you reduce the harms that come from crime, from criminality, and from those who do commit particularly the more serious crimes? And if you focus on harm reduction, you would do things in a very different way, as indeed they do in societies throughout the world, which have a much more pragmatic approach to crime and sentencing over that sense of just vengeance at all costs, almost. Even if the cost is more crime in the long run, we don't care because we want our punishment, we want our justice. So there are a number of societies, and the most common one, and I wrote about it in the book, is in Norway. And in Norway, very, very few people are ever sent to prison, to a custodial environment. And those that are tend to be only those who are violent and dangerous, those who the public need to be protected from. And I'm never arguing that there shouldn't be some form of detention for dangerous people. As you mentioned earlier, rapists, sex offenders in particular, need to be detained in some way. For me, the difficulty is not that aspect. The difficulty is when you have the vast majority of your prison population are non-violent offenders, most of them with very serious psychiatric problems, most of them with a history of life trauma. I mean, in the United Kingdom, for example, there's a shocking statistic that of the 80 or so thousand prisoners that we have in the UK, so over 50% of them were in our care system. In other words, were wards of the state as children, looked after in care homes or children's homes, etc. They only represent less than 1% of the population. So when you realize that what we're doing in effect is we're taking a group of people in our society who have from birth been grossly disadvantaged, often subjected to the most horrific trauma in their early lives, then taken into care, often flitting from home to home with no real centre, with no proper approach to education, often getting themselves into dangerous situations at young ages, and then finding themselves arrested, usually for something fairly trivial in their teens, even their early teens. And at that point, what we don't do as a society is say, okay, well, we're kind of responsible for these people because they're in the care of us, of the state, and the state has failed them in so many ways, and that's why they've ended up where they are. So how do we as a society get them out of that track, out of that lifestyle, give them the care, the support, and the resilience they need to get through their childhood, get through into adulthood, to get an education? If we focus on doing that, every time a 12-year-old is stopped with cannabis or drugs of some kind, even if they are selling it or acting as some sort of a runner, if we intervene at that stage and immediately ask ourselves, why is this child, this 12, 13, 14-year-old child, why are they in this situation, and what can we do to get them out of it? What we'll find is that instead of that 50-something percentage of the prison population being care leavers, instead of the statistic that I think it's 15 times more likely to go to prison if you've been in care than if you haven't. Instead of that, we might actually do something about that huge number of individuals who make up the majority of the prison population, look to find other constructive ways in which they can spend their young lives without the stigma of a criminal conviction and a sentence. And the way that I always put that is that if you think about what happens to a child when they're first arrested and treated as if they're an adult in effect, and taken to a court and given a sentence, and sometimes given a sentence in a child prison, as I call them, although they're called young offender institutions, they're prisons for kids. When we do all of that, it's exactly the same as if we had tattooed the word criminal across their forehead for the rest of their lives, because they go forward then with all of that experience, ingrained experience of criminal justice and of crime and of interactions with others who are involved in crime and criminality. And because of their criminal record, they'll find it almost impossible to get into education or work. And therefore, they end up in the only place that's left for them, which is the streets and the world of crime and gangs. And that's where we're failing as a society. And we're failing not only those young people who go through those experiences, but we're failing everybody, because everybody else are the victims of robberies or burglaries or, local drug dealing and disorder on the streets. Everybody suffers when we don't do the right thing for children at a young age. And of course, what then happens is that they become demonized. They become demonized in the media. They become, and if they do commit a very serious crime, then no one has any compassion around the reasons, and no one looks anxious to learn lessons from what's happened in those cases. And if we don't learn from what's happened in the past, we're not going to change the future.
There's an extreme case called the Jamie Bulger tragedy. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, the Jamie Bulger case was in the I think either late 80s or early 90s, and that was where two 10-year-old boys from deeply traumatized backgrounds and deeply disadvantaged backgrounds in broad daylight kidnapped a 3-year-old little boy called Jamie Bulger in a shopping centre in the north of Liverpool, and they took him and they beat him to death. And he was left. His body was left on some railway tracks nearby, and that was a case which was an extremely traumatizing event, I think, for the whole of the country, because it's almost impossible to imagine what the victim, what young Jamie Bulger went through. Of course, is the most extraordinary thing to even begin to imagine. But at the same time, also, what would motivate 10-year-olds to behave in that way? I have a 10-year-old son, and it's just unimaginable to me that he could ever do something of that kind. And of course, that's true. Very, very, very few 10-year-olds take a life, let alone take a life in such a violent way. But for me, the problem with that case was that we didn't look to learn lessons from it. All we looked to do was punish those two little boys who were put into an adult courtroom with all of the barristers wearing the wigs and gowns and all the solemnity of a criminal trial, exactly the same process as would have been gone through, if a 50-year-old or a 30-year-old were charged with murder. And that of itself, it seemed to me, was a fundamental distortion of what the criminal justice process should be about. Not least because the age of 10, as the age at which someone can be criminally responsible, is one of the youngest ages in the world. Even countries like Saudi Arabia have an age of criminal responsibility, which is, I think, 14, and some other countries go as high as 18, which is the same age at which someone becomes eligible to vote. So you can't be prosecuted, say in Luxembourg, for example, at the age of 16 for anything. You can be detained if you're dangerous, and you can be detained in a secure school educational environment. But what doesn't happen is that you don't get paraded in front of the media. You don't have your identity released to everybody, because in that case, their identities were made known, and then they essentially were marked for life by this experience, this day in their life, which of course was always going to have an impact on the rest of their lives. But the truth of it is that the way in which we dealt with that case, it seemed to me, said more about what's wrong with our society than it did with what's wrong with those two boys who did a terrible, awful thing and caused untold harm and damage to that young boy and his family, but at the same time would have completely lacked the emotional maturity or insight, let alone the responsibility, as it were, for making better choices. They just didn't have the toolkit for that, and that was because they were 10 years old. And that's where it went wrong. Had they been older, or even had they been dealt with, as I say, through an educational process and a reform process, I suspect that within a year or two, with the right support and therapy, they could have been on the other side, as it were, of the criminal justice process, and beginning some sort of life that might have involved education and work and a career. Instead, they spent many, many years initially in a children's sort of prison, and then later on transferred into an adult prison for something they did when they were 10 years of age. All of it, for me, is wrong. All of it achieves only one thing, which is the demonization of children, and it diverts attention from the real reasons why these things happen, and it stops us getting to grips with those problems, dealing with them in our society, and trying to actually reduce harm rather than simply to perpetrate harm through more and more criminalization of young people, which leads to more and more crime, which leads to yet another revolving door back into another prison. Each year, it costs around £50,000, or in US dollars, I guess 60,000 US dollars. Sorry, 40,000. 60,000 US dollars, about £50,000. And so,
depending on the day, it's different.
Depending on the day, and depending, of course, on the type of security in the particular prison, etc. So it does vary, but that's the average. Now, that, if you think about it, that's actually more than it costs to send a child to Eton, which is the public school which was attended to by, Prince William and Prince Harry and all of these aristocrats. Nowadays maybe Eton is actually about the same price because it's pretty pricey. But you can still, when you just think about that, you could be at the most elite educational establishment in the entire country for the same amount of money as being locked up pointlessly in a cell for year after year as a teenager. And the outcomes, of course, between those different institutions are unsurprisingly extremely different.
Yeah, there is this kind of struggle, I guess, in people like yourself who want to not necessarily do away with prison, but do away with these strictures around prison and make it more of a rehabilitating experience. But there's also the side of the victims' families where they don't want any of those two teenagers, those two kids who are 10 years old to ever see daylight again. They killed their baby boy and that's it. How do we struggle and also understand these two sides of some of the victims' families never want these people to ever see daylight, but we still need to pave a path for rehabilitation?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, the idea of sort of the victim's role in the process and how the families in particular of murder victims, to what extent should we be listening to their desires and wants and what they believe to be the appropriate outcome. And unfortunately, we have moved so far in the direction of victim-led justice, not just victim empathetic justice. So of course we have to understand the experiences of victims. And of course we have to respect them and treat them with enormous respect. We need to make available to them the right form of counselling, support, welfare support as they go through the most traumatic events of their life, dealing with the loss of a loved one and then dealing with the legal process that follows. So we have to respect their right to be supported and to be heard. But for me, it's gone far too far, because the minute you allow victims, in effect, to dictate the sentence that the judge imposes, then it goes away from being a criminal justice system that's there to protect the public, and it becomes a form of private justice where you're just getting vengeance on behalf of the victims. And incidentally, I talked earlier about the systems of justice in Greece and ancient Rome. Well, they had much the same approach, which was the victims or the family of the victims chose the punishment, and they could choose that the person be put to death, or they could choose to take some money instead. Now, when you start to look at that, that tells you that something's wrong, because the criminal justice system is not a system of private justice. It's a system of public justice on behalf of the public. So judges, when they sentence, should certainly listen to what victims say, but truth be told, the impact on the victims is not something, in most cases, which should have a huge impact on the sentence. What should have an impact on the sentence is firstly, of course, to look at what the person's actually done, because not every case involves a level of premeditation and a level of planning, etc. Many homicide cases are spur of the moment things which happen in a matter of minutes and someone is dead, and no one went into the room or went to the place expecting that to happen, but it blew up and it did happen. So we have to recognize that just because, even in the most serious cases of homicide, just because someone is killed doesn't necessarily mean that they are no good forever and that they should never be allowed to walk the streets. And we recognize that in our sentencing system in the UK, at least. But what we do need to do is say to ourselves, how do we square the circle between what the victims want, which are often the headlines picked up by the media, of course, are what the victims have said, and criticisms of the judge for being too soft or whatever it may be coming from the victim is very attractive to the media and it's very attractive to politicians. But unfortunately, it's not conducive to a system of justice that actually works and actually achieves the objective of reducing crime in our society and keeping those who offend from ever offending again. And if we focused our attention on that, we would do things very, very differently. And we certainly wouldn't have a system where victims can demand longer and longer sentences, as happens, and of course happens in every case, and they're actually listened to and sentences do ratchet up. That's what's been happening, and it's wrong, because victims have no more right to dictate the sentence in a public criminal case than any other member of the public. They are witnesses, they are victims, but they are not those who are responsible for deciding what the right sentence is. That is the job of a judge, and that is the job of a judge exercising proper considerations of justice, fairness and what's best for society. And if judges take that approach, and if they're allowed to take that approach, we will end up with a system where fewer people go to prison. When they do go, it's for shorter periods. And where they go, and this is the important part, where they go is an institution which spends its entire time with that person under that roof, focusing on the day of release. How do we get the day of release to be a day where the person leaves prison and has a home and has a job and has the skills to survive in society, has the therapeutic or other psychological support needed for addictions or mental health problems, and has maintained contact and effective and high quality contact with their family, with their friends. If we release people into society with all of those protections in place, then as they found in Norway and various other countries, the recidivism rate, the rate of return to prison, is extremely low. It's about 20%, and that's bearing in mind that most of those in Norway are violent offenders with a history of serious violence, not just sort of petty shoplifters or something of that kind. That is an extraordinary achievement to end up with only 20% recidivism. In the UK, over a lifetime, if we send a young person to a young offenders institution in this country, or a child prison as I call them, that child is almost certain to reoffend and almost certain to spend time in an adult prison. And we've made a system that achieves that perverse outcome. And if you think about it, if the criminal justice system was a manufacturer of cars, let's say it was Ford or Audi, and if every single car failed at some point in the first 3 years and broke down, then that company wouldn't survive. But our criminal justice system does that every day. It treats people in a way that within 3 years, most of them will reoffend and be back in prison. And that's a failure that we need to address head on, in the same way as it would be addressed if any other organization had such a catastrophic rate of failure in everything it does.
So then what are the steps to not abolish the is it abolish the prison industrial complex that we just want to do away with?
I think the idea, and even just the name prison industrial complex, which is absolutely what it is in most Western countries, and certainly in the United States, where you have these huge corporations running prisons all over the place and making vast profit from human misery. And that's the truth. That's what happens in the US. And in many British jails, which are also privately run and privately owned. So you have to get rid of profit as a motive in any criminal justice system, because profit by definition requires organizations, those who run prisons, they need prisoners. They need people to come and actually be sentenced, and they need them to be sentenced as long as possible, and they need them to come back again as quickly as possible. Now, when you think about that perverse incentive on a private prison organization to fail, they are incentivized to fail because they get paid for every day that someone spends in prison, and every one of the 1,000 or 2,000 prisoners in the institution, they get paid for locking them up, keeping them under lock and key, feeding them very badly, barely educating them at all, and leaving them with no prospect of a successful life on the outside. Well, we are incentivizing the perverse, and when you do that, you get perverse outcomes. And I'm afraid the United States prison industrial complex, which I talk about in the book, and I call it the city of incarceration, because I think if the prison system in the United States was a city, it would be the 5th largest city in the United States. I think slightly behind Houston, or maybe even slightly ahead of Houston. But when you think about that, millions of people living in prison, all paid for by the taxpayer. All of it, and vast sums of that going into private hands and private profit. No, I just cannot rationalize that. So for me, the idea is you scrap prisons as we conceive of them now. We have all these huge buildings all over the country, including some in prime city centre locations all over the place. What you do instead is you create custodial environments which are there for one purpose: to train, to educate, to support, and to change patterns of behavior. And if you do that, you have people living in housing units where they can cook their own food in smaller groups, where they can socialize in a more natural and normal way. You don't put them in a warehouse full of thousands of other people shuffling around with clanking bars, etc. All of that architecture of prisons, which goes back, much of it, to the Victorian period of English history, when these huge Victorian prisons were built out of red brick all up and down the country. That was all done at a time when there was a belief that somehow the mere fact of incarcerating people in a place like this was an end of itself, rather than a means to an end. The means to the end being how do we reduce the recidivism and repeat offending? So we have to change the architecture of our prisons. We have to change the entire ethos of our prisons. And in my opinion, it would do no harm to change the name too. Why call them prisons at all? Let's call them what they should be, which is rehabilitation centres. Because if they're not focused on that as their core reason to exist, they will fail society, as I've said a number of times already, and they will fail all of us because they will constantly release people back onto the streets who reoffend often within hours. I've had clients who have been released from long sentences, 6, 7, 8 years, and even longer sentences than that, and who have been back on the streets committing robberies and serious crimes within days of release, and in one case, the same day, and in another case, having escaped from prison, committing robberies whilst on the run. Why is that? Is it because all of these prisons are so successful and they do such a good job of dealing with people who have committed terrible crimes? Or is it because they've utterly failed to do so? And in my opinion, the answer is absolutely clear. We fail our prisoners, but we at the same time, we fail our society every single day that we run these institutions in the way that we do now.
What are the biggest criticisms that people have for you and for your work? Are they talking about you being too soft, or you just don't want to, provide people with the right punishment, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you get the more generalized. I mean, I do many media interviews and, with journalists, right-wing journalists who have a very different perspective, whether they do or not, but they certainly say they do, because that appeals to the audiences that they're looking to cultivate.
Super sorry to interrupt you, but in terms of this political divide, I don't want to make it political, but are you saying that this perspective that you have is more left-wing?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's perceived that way. So my view is that there is a perception, and indeed it's a perception borne out sometimes in practice, but not always. But there's a perception that those on the left, or the more liberal sort of wings of politics, are more likely to advocate for prison reform and reduced sentencing than those on the right, particularly the far right, who are more likely to advocate for the death penalty, life without parole, very, very long sentences, very harsh prison conditions. So that's been the sort of the binary debate, that's the way in which it's often been framed. But the reality is that governments of every colour, including in the UK, have time after time increased sentences, increased the number of people in prison, and increased the number of years that each of them spends in prison, time after time after time. And the most famous government really that did the most in that regard was not a Conservative or right-wing government. It was the Labour government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown from 1997 to 2010, which increased the prison population more than any other government in the entire time that I've been a criminal lawyer, which is over 30 years. So in the end, it's not really a political or left versus right issue. It's a pragmatism versus emotion issue. So the emotional argument, that the appeal to the public's sense of fairness, or more importantly, the sense of vengeance and punishment, which many people are ingrained to have and absolutely believe is the right way to go. So it's much easier to appeal to that mentality when it comes to an election cycle than it is to appeal to the public to say, let's do things differently, where the difference will be that fewer people will go to prison, and that when they do go, it will be for a shorter period of time, and it will be much more focused on rehabilitation and getting people into work, getting people into secure housing. Because many members of the public think that these people, as no doubt they're called, and they are called from time to time, these people don't deserve it because of what they've done. Well, if they don't deserve it, that's a whole different argument about which I have no view. Whether they deserve it or not, if we don't give them some sort of rehabilitative support, they will definitely commit another crime again. So I couldn't look the victim of that next crime in the face in conscience and say, I'm still support the fact that we had this punitive punishment system which removed any opportunity for this person ever to have a job, ever to have a secure living environment, so that he was back on the streets, so that he ended up robbing your house or stealing your car. If we're gonna make sure that we guarantee that's going to happen time and again, let's be honest enough to tell new victims, say, yes, this is the 75th crime that's been committed by this individual. The very first one was stealing sweets when he was 12, and nobody noticed that he was an abused child. Nobody noticed that he was a feral child who was living on the streets and had no effective parental control. Or if they did, they didn't care. But if they had have done, the chances are that there wouldn't have been 75 crimes. There'd have only been that very first one.
So, in the same way that healthcare right now is more reactive than proactive, the doctor never tells me to eat, train, sleep well, and hydrate well. They just give me a pill when I come, and it's iatrogenic. It's a pill to combat a pill to combat a pill. It seems like our prison system and our justice system is the same way. It's not proactive; it's reactive.
It's
And so,
exactly that. It's exactly that. And so, the metaphor holds in almost every way. So when you look at the costs, for example, in the UK of health spending, so it's the biggest item in our public expenditure is the National Health Service, and everybody knows that the UK has a public health service with 1 million employees, and that one of the largest organisations on the planet in terms of numbers of people working for it, and of course the number of patients treated. But that system is vastly wasteful for the reasons that you've indicated, because care is only really available at the highest level when somebody has a heart attack, or when they get cancer, or when they have some other potentially fatal condition. Then we can spend tens and tens of thousands treating them, when actually all they needed was to be guided from childhood into making better choices about food. And of course, that's another issue altogether. But in the prison system, it's exactly the same. Instead of trying to exercise a degree of influence at the early stages of life in a positive direction, which might see off all of these huge expenses. I mean, keeping a person in prison, as I've already said, on average, a recidivist offender will cost the country £1 million, or give or take, 1.2 million US dollars. So that's a huge amount of money to waste on an individual who will never, as a result of the way that the system works, will never in many cases have a law-abiding existence, pay taxes and go to work. And if you have a system that stops people effectively doing that, then you have a system which is plainly unfit for purpose, because it makes it worse rather than better.
so I forget what the term is in criminology, but I know that there are like these three factors in telling if a child is going to be a serial killer, or just it's enresis, setting it like a pyromania, and then hurting animals. I forget the actual term in criminology. But is there a way to tell if someone is going to be, commit a crime or something like that? Not in terms of thought police, but like, is there a path to pre-rehabilitation? Like,
It absolutely is, because if you just take the one example I gave you earlier of being in the care system, that is the single clearest indicator that someone is likely to end up in prison, is that they've been in the care system. So that of itself tells you something, doesn't it? It tells you where you should be focusing your attention and your resource is not on those who have offended in their 20s and 30s later on. Focus the resource on those children in the care system. Find ways to make their childhoods less traumatic. Find ways to ensure that they have the same access to opportunity and education as everybody else, because they absolutely don't. And education and emotional support and support around counselling, psychological trauma, which is so ingrained in many of those, in both the care system and the criminal justice system. That support, if you use that resource to try to deal with those young people at the early stages of their life, when they have faced all of those traumas. I give you another example. I made a television series a couple of years ago, and for the BBC, and in the course of that, I went to interview a number of young people in a child prison up in Scotland, and I also interviewed and so we're going down to as young as 13 or 14, but they're still in a prison with walls and bars and barbed wire and everything else. And I spoke to the governor. I interviewed the governor of the prison, who was a lady in her 50s who'd been in the prison system working with young people mostly for 30 odd years. And she said, people do not understand the young people in my care. She said one of them has witnessed, by the age of 15, 5 unusual or traumatic deaths in their presence. So that's violence, that's drug overdose, that's an accident because of taking drugs or taking some other substance. Or when you just think about that, if a young person at the age of 15 has witnessed 5 violent or unnatural deaths, can you imagine the trauma that person has gone through? Can you imagine what it would take to try to preserve some sense of well-being for them, and to give them some hope for the future when they've seen all of that? One of them was one of their own parents who had died of a drug overdose. those are the sorts of young people who are predominantly in our prison systems, or in our youth justice systems, and then in our prisons. So to answer your question, prevention is absolutely better than cure, and there are very, very clear and obvious ways that you can intervene at every stage of someone's life, actually, but much more effectively the earlier you start. And if you integrate it into the welfare, education, and support packages, if you integrate diversion from sort of criminal associates, from gangs, which often is the reason why children get involved in crime, is because they're recruited aggressively and actively recruited by gangs. If you put in place measures to address all of those risk factors when they're very young, then you'll find that many more of them will navigate their teenage years without becoming involved in the criminal justice system, without going to a child prison, and therefore they will be infinitely more likely to get qualifications and a career, which means that their life can take off in the right direction rather than the wrong one from the very start.
Yeah, I always imagine classes in school talking about what prison is like and why not to commit a crime, and how to kind of not tell if you're going to be a violent offender, but just guide people along certain lines and just give them information. I think one of the things is that we try to baby our children too much, and we don't want to expose them to the world, but then we don't realize that the world is going to be exposed to them down the line. But I'll just leave that there. One of the things I always wonder is our media playing a vital role and an increasingly sinister role in shaping the minds of young people? And I think the answer is yes. We look at things like 13 Reasons Why, TV shows like 13 Reasons Why or Euphoria, and these show like 13 Reasons Why was suicide, and there were a bunch of teen suicides after the fact. Euphoria is drugs, and I can only imagine that a bunch of teens are starting to use drugs because of that. What is kind of the role of media in shaping young people that create that pipeline to the prison system? Should there be a lot of control?
I'm not sure that the media at the moment has much of a positive role to play in that, because if you look at the media coverage of any case involving a child defendant, which are mostly murder cases or very serious cases, because otherwise young children are much less likely to go into the criminal courts, particularly the adult courts. But when you look at the coverage of those cases, universally, the one word which stands out in headlines is evil. And the other word which often stands out is monster or monsters. And when you characterize a 12 or 13-year-old or even a 10-year-old as an evil monster, then what the media is effectively doing is immediately othering othering those young people, othering those children. So they're not us. They're not actually part of our society at all. They're not even, in many ways, they're not even human beings, is often the media narrative. And when you add into that the fact that there is a significant racial disparity of those in the criminal justice system in both the UK and the US, and I'm sure in Canada, when you add that into the mix, many of those who are being othered, who are being called evil monsters, are from ethnic minorities, which of itself is damaging and dangerous, because those communities are often most harshly policed and most harshly affected by criminal justice policy. And so you end up then with the subtext of those appalling headlines is not only evil monster for a child, but often evil monster for a black child or an Asian child in the UK. And that then gets used by the more extreme commentators, particularly on social media, to start making arguments about immigration and race and all the other kind of malign kind of commentary which you get, ignorant commentary. And we had a case, a very high-profile case in the UK last year, where 3 children were killed by a 17-year-old boy in a town called Southport in the north of England. He went into a children's dance class for very young children and started stabbing them all. Within a day or two, the media reported that he was an illegal immigrant and a Muslim activist and everything else, none of which was true. So you had him being demonized, perhaps understandably, of course, for the crimes. I'm not saying it's healthy to demonize people in that way, but I can understand it. But when you ally that with false information about who the person is, what their background is, then you have a double double harm done to our society, because suddenly you have racial injustice as well, and you have riots. We had riots on the street, people rioting outside mosques, for example, about this particular, as a result of this particular crime, even though plainly those attending a mosque in some 100 miles away from the event had absolutely nothing to do with it, and neither did the Muslim faith. But nevertheless, that was what was fixated upon from the beginning. Much false social media commentary, then picked up by the mainstream media, and the same narrative, false narratives and damaging narratives put forward. So I think the media absolutely has an important part to play, but sadly it uses its huge responsibility and its huge influence, often in a malign way, for the understandable reason that media outlets and newspapers and websites, they make all of their money from people reading their stuff, being attracted to it and buying into it and following them on Twitter and commenting on it. And that's how they make their money. And so they're quite happy to inflame tension, to cause riots, to cause damage to be done in our society, all in the name of increased viewers and increased listeners and increased readers. And that's something as a society that I think we at some point need to grapple with.
Do you think the media's role in creating a fury around crime is precisely why people want the death penalty? You know, I read Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, just showcasing how throughout history we've gotten kind of calmer as a species, more peaceful. Maybe that's TBD in this
Until
day.
recently, yeah.
But it does force you to ask the question: is the death penalty appropriate in certain circumstances? For you, is the death penalty appropriate at all, or is there?
Death penalty is never appropriate. It doesn't achieve anything at all, except to inflame that that really virulent kind of public opinion, which, as I say, going back to the use of the phrase "evil monster" in every death penalty case, you will hear those words in one way, shape, or form. Maybe not those exact words, but a similar set of words used. And none of that is true. You know, people do evil things; they commit evil deeds. But I've met murderers, and I sat down last week in a room with 12 or 13 convicted murderers, and doing a book club about my own book in a high security prison. And I listened to them, and many of them are intelligent, articulate, thoughtful, and some of them have been in prison for over 20 years by the stage that I met them last week. And it's so unhelpful to simply characterize them as evil monsters and talk about having the death penalty. The main reason why I'm against the death penalty is because I don't believe anyone, and I'm not a religious person myself, but I don't believe anyone has the right to take a life. I don't believe, unless it's obviously in self-defense to prevent someone else taking a life, which in certain circumstances might apply to what you could, if there is such a thing, a just war. You know, a soldier in battle, is defending himself and his country. Well, it's provided that the war is just, such as the war against the Nazis, then unfortunately that's a price that is paid for the way that society works. Likewise, as I say, self-defense. But for a society as a whole to endorse the murdering of another individual by an artificial process where there's no attempt or intention to protect anyone, it's purely vengeance. And the other aspect to it being that it has no deterrent effect. There is no evidence whatsoever. I mean, the United States, in many states of the US, and the federal US system has the death penalty available, and many states carry out significant numbers of executions, including the state of Texas in particular. But when you look around the United States, and when you look at what's happened in terms of violence and homicide over the past few generations, you'll see that it has had no impact. If there is a direction of travel, it's upwards. And yet that's a country which has the death penalty available in many places, and also there has something like 60 or 70,000 people serving life without parole. They'll never be released. Some of them for things they did as a child. So that whole system, that whole idea of just looking to extract vengeance, including through the death penalty, is utterly discredited when it comes to reducing crime. And for however many times I've said it in this interview, if we're not reducing crime through our criminal justice system, we're basically throwing money down the drain and damaging our society in a number of very serious ways.
I don't know if this is third rail enough, but I'll ask it anyway. You know, in places like Singapore or Dubai, if you bring a certain amount of marijuana, for instance, even if it's legal in Canada or Colorado or wherever, if you bring it to that country, you immediately get the death penalty. And
Well, that's not true. That's not strictly true. Certainly not in Dubai or in Singapore. Each of those places, there is a minimum amount before you would qualify to be considered a trafficker. So traffickers absolutely can get the death penalty in Dubai or in particular in Singapore, quite notoriously so. So that's absolutely the case. So they will impose the death penalty on someone who has not killed anyone, and not even committed a murder. So that, when you look at it, those societies operate in very different ways. They're not really democratic societies. They are societies largely autocratic, largely pragmatic, financially driven societies, and societies which don't really respect human rights. Now, of course, they're entitled as a sovereign country to take those positions. But if we were to do the same in this country, and we saw how badly it went wrong in the Philippines, for example, when we ended up with, basically extrajudicial murder being committed on the streets of Manila and other cities in the Philippines. All that happens is society becomes slightly more impoverished, slightly worse, and nothing happens to reduce the harms, for example, of drugs. Drugs are, I talk about this at some length in Justice on Trial. Drugs have been with us since way before human beings existed in their modern form. People were taking some sort of stimulants and some sort of, hallucinogenic leaves and substances going back 5, 6, 50,000 years. And so the idea that you just make a law and say that no one's allowed to do this is it's the same as banning breathing or sneezing. There are certain patterns of human behavior which are ingrained and have been since time began, and the prohibition of drugs, and we went back to the prohibition of alcohol, of course, 100 years ago. The prohibition of any substance which is widely taken and widely used and has been since time began is never going to work. And if you then start to put the genie back in the bottle by executing those involved in it, all you do is degrade and deface the edifice of justice in your society. But most importantly, you actually make the drug problem worse, because under a criminalized and prohibited drug system, drugs are very, very expensive. In a legal and licensed drug system, drugs are very, very cheap. And so if you have a system that creates this huge sort of profit model from start to finish, the heroin poppies of Afghanistan feeding through into processed pure heroin in Pakistan, being then transported via Turkey into the mainland Europe, the UK and beyond. All of that, every single stage, people are making money, people are being killed through competition, through being targeted by other gangs, etc. And when you sort of analyze all of that, why are we doing any of that? What to what end? And the answer is a straightforward one. We started on this course back in the early 1970s when Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and he decided to run for office for re-election on a platform of launching a war on drugs. Just the same nonsense that's now being spoken by Donald Trump about how we're going to stop the flow of drugs. We're going to stop this problem. We had it from Ronald Reagan as well, another war on drugs in the early 1980s. Well, all that happened since 1970, when both the US and the UK and many other countries around the world under US pressure brought in strict laws to prohibit drugs and very, very serious sentences for those who traffic in drugs. All that's happened is a massive explosion in the use of drugs, a massive explosion in the use in particular of the most addictive and dangerous drugs such as fentanyl and crack cocaine. All of those things have exploded because we've left the supply of drugs and the drug supply chain to criminals, when actually we as a society should accept, as we do with alcohol, at least in the UK and not everywhere, of course, but we accept that there are drugs that people use, want to use, will always use. And the important thing is to license the supply chain, to make sure that the pricing disincentivizes criminal gangs from being involved, and offer the sorts of medical and psychological and counselling support that people may choose to use if they want to come off drugs. But if they don't want to come off drugs, and some people don't and some people can't, then they should be able to take them safely and without needing to resort to crime in order to pay for them. And at the moment, that's the biggest problem we have. They're so expensive that most drug users cannot use drugs without committing crime. So we're actually creating a direct link between our policy of prohibition and crime on the streets, and the sorts of crime also that most people found the most hard to deal with, which are street robberies and burglaries of people's homes where property is stolen to pay for drugs, generally at a massively discounted price, of course, because if they steal, your television, they'll sell it for £20 or 50, however much they can get there and then. So you're taking this something that might be worth £1,000 that it's being sold for 50 on the criminal network, all of that so that someone can have drugs for one day, and when they could have a secure and safe supply of drugs, unadulterated, with clean needles and with medical support in the way that they do in Switzerland, for example, with heroin, they could have all of that at a tiny fraction of the cost and with no harms in the form of crime associated with it. So one of the most important things that we can do as a society is stop the illusory idea that was created by Nixon and promulgated through the last 50 years that we can somehow stop drugs and we can win a war on drugs. That's unwinnable. Let's be rational and pragmatic. And once again, if we are, we will see huge reductions in crime associated with drugs and huge reductions in the harms associated with drugs, in particular, overdoses and violence associated with the drug trade. That's where we should be focused. Stop the massive overdoses that we're seeing in our Western societies in particular, and stop the wars on the streets that are killing so many young people every day.
Yeah, it was never a war on drugs. It was a war on people using drugs. I think that's blatantly obvious. We look to Portugal as an example of how to legalize drugs without a massive increase in drug usage. Can you speak to how Portugal has done this?
Yeah, well, but Portugal for many years it doesn't have a legal system. It has a decriminalized system, which is very different. So in Portugal, the system is that you're entitled to have a certain quantity of any drug in your possession for personal use, but you're not entitled to sell it. And of course, the problem with that is that it means that the only people who supply drugs are criminal gangs, the same as everywhere else. So Portugal certainly achieved a lot in terms of harm reduction. There are many fewer drug deaths, for example, in Portugal, because those who use illegal drugs know that they can seek medical help. They're not going to be reported for possession of drugs or what have you, or using drugs, because that's not a crime in Portugal. It's been decriminalized. So people can access health services more readily. And the cost of drugs is actually lower, no doubt, because many drugs are supplied by people who buy a certain amount for themselves and then sell half of it to their friend and that kind of thing. So the market's a lot freer in that sense. But the most important advances that there have been in Portugal have been a reduction in the harm to drug users and a reduction of the amount of waste that goes on in most other societies by arresting those people, locking them up for possession of one wrap of heroin or £20 worth of crack cocaine, putting them in court, putting them in prison, possibly jailing them for a week, a month or 6 months, or if they've been selling it for 4 or 5 years, even though they're only selling it to finance their own habits. So all of these things are just counterintuitive. They make sense only if you buy that narrative of the war on drugs, which, as you've rightly pointed out, was a myth from the beginning. It's a war on drug users and it's a war on drug suppliers. But it's not a war on drugs themselves, and drugs themselves, of course, are neutral. They don't have any moral value. They are a chemical substance of one kind or another. It's only what we do with them and the way that we treat them in our society that changes their character from one of voluntary consumption in circumstances where someone is relatively safe because the product has been quality controlled and has been made in a factory and has very clear information on the packet about what's in it, to a system where people are taking substances they have no idea that it's packed with fentanyl and it's going to stop their heart in 5 minutes flat. And that's what's happening up and down America and all over the world at the moment. Fentanyl is killing people because fentanyl is introduced into the illegal supply chain because it's cheap to produce and extremely powerful. We would never have fentanyl in the drug supply chain in a legal and licensed system. It would be gone.
How is that? Can you say more about that?
Well, because if you had a legal and licensed system, people go to a dispensary. I visited a heroin-assisted treatment program in Geneva, which is Switzerland has actually gone so far as to make it a constitutional right that you can access drug treatment and drug rehabilitation therapy at public expense. Anyone can. It's a constitutional right because addiction is recognised in Switzerland as a disability, just like any other, as a medical condition which people do not choose. And all of the evidence shows that that's the case, that people don't choose these things. There's no choice, no moral failure. Some people are predisposed to addiction. Some people are tempted or indeed prevailed upon to try drugs, often at a young age, and become addicted very quickly. So what they do in Switzerland instead is they give heroin away for free to users. They can come to the clinic in the morning and they can have heroin in the morning. It's pharmaceutical grade. It's completely pure. Everybody knows exactly what's in it. The dosage is controlled based on the individual, the body size and various other characteristics, how enduring their use is. And they can do the same at the end of the day, and they come back and they have more heroin, always under medical supervision, always with nurses and doctors on hand. If someone does overdose or someone does go into a potential overdose, there are doctors and nurses to give them Narcan, the drug that will sort of revive someone in an overdose situation. All of those things are available. And what you end up with is that most of those people that come to that clinic, and I say I visited, sat in the waiting room, spoke to them, spoke to the staff, saw the system. Most of those people leave in the morning and go to work or go to university and study law or economics, because it's not the drugs that take people away from society. It's the need to constantly feed an illegal habit and to find hundreds or thousands of pounds a week, usually thousands of pounds a week, to finance the habit. Once you remove that, and they can come and get the heroin for free, many of them, in fact, after a year or two, or even shorter periods, just eventually stop coming and stop using. But others do keep coming and using, and some of them will keep using for a lifetime. But if they do, it will cost the state a tiny fraction of what it would cost in a prohibited system to keep those people in and out of prison, with them never working and never actually doing anything productive in society, as happens in most societies when it comes to drugs. So Switzerland, a country not renowned for being radical or left-wing, and it certainly isn't, is a country which has simply taken a pragmatic view that if we do this with heroin, we have fewer harms from heroin, and it has been a resounding success. It was a society which in the 1980s had hundreds of drug users, heroin users, in public places, shooting up heroin in railway stations in front of children or in parks and playgrounds. Now, that's unheard of in Switzerland. The number of drug users has dramatically fallen. The number of social harms from drugs has dramatically fallen. And equally importantly, the cost of dealing with drugs and drugs in society has fallen to a very, very low level compared to where it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So it works. When you do it, it works in practice. This is not just theory. This is real policy on the streets, working in places like Geneva and Zurich.
How do you abstract these, not even abstract, but how do you import these understandings into the UK and the US? Is there any shot, any chance that we could have these kind of decriminalized or legalized frameworks for drugs in these countries?
I think it's highly unlikely that we'll go beyond cannabis because the problem is that there is this, that narrative around drugs being evil and there being a war on them as a result is ingrained in the psyche of Western societies and has been for the last 50 years since the introduction of all of that legislation that I mentioned. And so I think it's very, very hard to convince people that giving free heroin to heroin addicts is a good idea. I think, and of course, we talked about the media earlier. Well, the media don't like that kind of thing either, or whether they do or they don't. They know that a headline saying, do-gooders give free heroin to heroin addicts who've stolen someone's car or, whatever in the past. That kind of, just rabble-rousing and kind of the inflammation of tension and anger towards this group of people, most of whom, once again, I've met dozens, probably hundreds and hundreds actually over my career of either active addicts or former addicts who are in recovery. And the idea that they wanted to be drug addicts and that this was a choice is so ridiculous that I find it hard to believe that anyone kind of says that or thinks that. But when you read media coverage about policy, every time I do an interview and say we should legalize heroin, the journalist will say, "Oh, come on, Chris, are you seriously suggesting that the British taxpayer, my listeners or my viewers, should be using their hard-earned money to put heroin in someone else's veins?" And my answer to that is, well, they're using their hard-earned money now to keep them in prison, and it costs them 10 times as much. So which is better? It's pretty obvious when you think about it, but it's very, very difficult. You always end up, or I always end up, in those sorts of interviews when there's a phone in afterwards or something like that. It's always me that is the one that's crazy and lefty. And even though I'm not particularly left wing, but it's perceived in that way because I think it's a really hard ask in our current political climate. And it's almost, you don't need to say it, but our current political climate is so incendiary and it's so lacking in sort of informed policy debate and rational discussion, and it's so emotive and so it involves so much personal characterization and hatred that kind of approach, which is dominating our discourse in every headline that we read every day, is the exact opposite of what you need to have a grown-up and informed debate about what the best thing to do is for our society, and without throwing stones at anybody that suggests something different, as we do at the moment.
There's always this injection of politics in everything. And it's very frustrating because you really can't have a good conversation without somebody saying, "Oh, that's just the left-wing crap," or "That's just the right-wing crap." And you don't get anywhere. It feels like my generation was supposed to do away with this, but they're still going down this path. On that, yeah, go ahead.
No, but I think you make a really good point. It is very hard to have a conversation or discussion in our society, or discussion on the media, or just in the pub or wherever. It's very hard without people retrenching to quite extreme positions on everything. We know that the United States has shown that in the most extraordinary way over the last few years. In fact, probably the last decade, where the United States has become utterly polarized as a society. Would split almost down the middle. But the same is increasingly the case in the UK. I can't speak to Canada. It's not a country that I have huge expertise or knowledge about. But certainly in the UK, we are seeing the same phenomenon, which is everything is distilled to a binary war between left and right, or between the establishment, the elites, and some other group. But there's always a significant and clear binary division and very little common ground. And the reality of policy is that you can only make good policy where you find common ground. Where policy results from an extreme position, which takes a very, very tough line on something, but doesn't recognise the nuances and also doesn't address the pragmatic reality of the problem, then you will end up with bad policy. You'll end up with 2.5 million people in prison, and you'll end up with the highest rates of drug overdose that any society on the planet has ever seen before. And that's where the United States has currently ended up.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's sad and frustrating, but also at the same time, like, I'm so lucky that the listeners of this show really don't give a shit about any of that, and they want to learn and they want to interact, and they don't want to just be Procrustean in certain boxes, and they want to have nuanced discussions. So, listeners of this show are just incredible. Chris, I do want to respect your time, so I'll just have to ask you the last handful of questions. What advice do you have for young people, just in the space of, I guess, prison reform, drugs? Not that you're advocating for that.
So that's a good question, and so I've got 6 children, and they're aged between 10 and 18. So I have that generation of children who are growing up with all of the noise politically that goes on. And I think most of them, frankly, are quite turned off by it. They don't like. And I think when you talk about your generation, or my children's generation, obviously somewhat younger than you, but when you talk about those generations, I actually, that's the one place that I see some sort of cause for hope and optimism, because I hear my children talk about some of the same issues we've been talking about, and they are not stuck onto that, on that binary kind of analysis of the world, which is, and of course there are young people who are, and I fully understand there are many young people who take exactly the same views of their parents or anyone else. There are many like that, but I think the area of hope is that your listeners and my children are able to kind of see through some of the noise And actually, I think that there has developed amongst most young people, certainly many, many young people, I think a view that life isn't as simple as bad and good people, that life involves sort of complex and nuanced events, that people can do things for reasons that we can understand and that we need to learn from. And I think young people in particular are much less judgmental when it comes to drug use or mental health problems, which lies behind many, many interactions with criminal justice. So I think if there's a hope, it's that before too long we get rid of this octogenarian generation of policymakers, or very significantly elderly policymakers who are stuck in the 1970s, and we see some of your generation, and I hope my children's generation, coming through and bringing some of that more enlightened thinking which young people have, into policy when they too, and when you hopefully one day are the Prime Minister of Canada, because who knows how long the present one will last.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's always a daunting question. If you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
I think it would be, I would stop criminalizing children, and I would do something to support the lives of young people who find themselves in trauma and find themselves in damaging and disadvantaged circumstances. If we support children, the knock-on effect later is so great. It's almost a butterfly effect. If you can intervene with one 10-year-old child when they get arrested for something, or they get stopped by the police with a knife, or whatever it is, you can intervene with them and divert them from the course that they may have been about to embark upon. Then you save them a lifetime of trauma and pain. You save all the potential victims of crime from them exactly the same lifetime of negative experience, and you save society huge amounts of money, which can be used for more useful things.
As the last question, what gives you hope in the world?
I think children and young people give me hope, and it would be strange if it were any other way. I think when I hear my own daughter, who's just about to turn 14, expressing her concern about the environment, expressing her concern about the abuse of gay people and of other minorities, and ethnic minorities, and the fact that she's so passionate in supporting the rights of others and enlightenment. When I hear that coming from a 13-year-old, if that gives me hope, and all of my children thankfully have a much more balanced and much more enlightened view of the world than many, if not most people my age.
Love it. Love it. Well, Chris, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for
No
entertaining the
problem.
questions and speaking at length. You definitely didn't waffle on at all. Where can we find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter, Daw KC. You can find me. My YouTube channel has a lot of content which might be interested of those of your listeners who might be interested in becoming lawyers or a legal career. There's loads of content around that on my YouTube channel, which again is Daw QC, KC rather now. So you can find me all over those places. And I hope when this episode goes out, tag me in, and I'll do my best to get you a few more listeners if I can. I don't know how many people follow me in your age demographic, but we'll find out.
Well, it should be so much more. I think Gen Z have a lot to learn from you, and I can't wait for them to do that. So,
Very kind.
Chris, thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Ed.
much.
And good luck with the show.